Yeah, they're all coming.
Lovely.
Recognise some names there. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Numbers are ticking up. It's so hot outside. I bet they're all in the garden as well, watching this.
I was swimming in the sea this morning, actually, so it's a great start to the day.
Oh, lovely. Right, I think there's one or two still joining us, but we'll get going. Lovely. So, hello and welcome. I'm Becca Harding, and I'm chairman of the Society of Women Writers and Journalists, and this is the second in our up close and personal series of interviews with authors. It's great to have you all joining us today. And I have the pleasure of talking to Sunday Times-bestselling author JANE CORRY as she launches her new book, I Made a Mistake. It's a psychological thriller about a woman driven to extremes after a one-night stand, and it's made number 7 in the Sunday Times bestseller charts. I'm halfway through and I have to say I'm completely hooked. It's great. Yes. So she has been a member of the Society as well for years, so we're very pleased to have her here. Jane is a former magazine journalist who's also spent 3 years working as the writer-in-residence for High Security Prison for Men. So Jane was a tutor in creative writing at Oxford University and is a regular contributor to the Daily Telegraph and My Weekly magazine. Now, if you have any questions for Jane, and there is a possibility at the end to ask them, there's a Q&A button at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So you should be able to see it at the bottom. If you click on that, it'll give you an opportunity to post your questions. So Jane, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very well, and thank you very much for asking me to be on this. It's lovely to see you, and I can't see everybody else who's joined, but I just want to say hi and how much I love the SWWJ.
Oh, that's great. It's lovely to have you here. So we're nearly out of lockdown. How's it been for you?
Gosh, well, it's been very strange because as well as being a full-time writer, I always look after my grandchildren for 2 days a week, for 22 hours a day, while my daughter and son-in-law work. And of course that had to stop. So it's been a huge gap in my life. They live just around the corner. And although we got to the stage where I was able to see them, I wasn't able to hug them. So I know that some of you will identify with that. It's been very odd. I was very grateful that I'm still writing next year's book. So like many writers, my routine didn't change that much in the morning. That's my writing time. Yeah. So I would go up and write. But then I found, I have to say, that I had time on my hands, which I'd sort of always been wanting and now didn't know what to do with. So let's just say my allotment looks a lot better than it did before coronavirus.
What are you growing? What's going on there at the moment?
Oh, well, I'm a terrible gardener. I have black fingers. My sister and I joke that she inherited mummy's an ability to garden, but I am growing courgettes because they're fairly foolproof. And
that's my vegetable of choice as well in the garden.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've been keeping a diary throughout the period, haven't you? So.
Yes. Well, what happened was day one of this, and it was all such a shock for everyone, wasn't it? I was actually waiting for my editor to come back with the next stage of edit. So I actually didn't have anything to write for, I knew, at least 2.5 weeks. And I have to write. I'm hopeless if I'm not writing. And in particular, if something bad is going on in my life, I have to write. It's my way of blocking everything out. So I had a letter from a great uncle with wonderful old spidery writing saying, this corny virus is a dreadful nuisance, but we'll get through it. And I thought, yes, corny virus, it takes away the fear. So I went up and I started writing. I went up, I write on the top of my house, overlooking the sea. You can just see it over the rooftops. Oh, nice. And I started writing a daily cornivirus diary on my Facebook. And it was really, for me, more than anything, to express my feelings. And then it seemed to catch on. And I've had lots of lovely emails from people saying it's helped them, which is nice. So.
That's great. People can join your Facebook page.
They can make comments, and yes, I didn't use Facebook very much before the coronavirus, so it's been one of those revelations.
Yeah, no, I'm quite addicted, actually. It's the one thing I use quite a lot. So how did you get started as a writer? How did it initially start for you?
I've always written stories. Ever since I was a little girl, I used to write little stories, little poems, and as I went through school, it was really the only thing I could do. I was at a rather academic girls' school in London, and I always considered myself to be pretty dim compared with everyone else, but the only thing I could do, the only thing I could do was write stories, and I just presumed this was something everyone could do. And when I left school, I read English at university. and I knew I had to have a job which involved writing. So I was lucky enough to get a magazine traineeship with Thompson Newspapers and trained as a journalist, wrote for women's magazines, all the way. You know, I kept thinking one day I want to write that novel, but I didn't consider myself old enough, which is actually now something I tell students and school children: you're never too young or too old, to write a novel. And then I turned freelance, and I had my wonderful children. And by the time I got to my youngest, after 3, I thought I was in my mid-30s, and I thought, well, if I don't start writing this novel, it's never going to happen. So I wrote a story, a novel called Amish and Wives, because we lived near Amersham, about a journalist swapping places with a mother, Harris mother. Got an agent almost immediately from the writers and artists. I thought, oh, well, this is a doddle. And then spent the next 12 years trying to get published. So basically, I'd write a novel a year, and I'd have near misses. I got taken in on 3 occasions to editorial meetings. There was always something that wasn't quite right, or it was too like something else they'd taken on, or whatever.
Oh, no.
And then I tried a pseudonym, and a different agent, and then I got my first romance published. And then my 27-year-old marriage ended. At the same time, a regular column that I was writing for a woman's magazine came to an end because the editor left. And as many of you will know, that often heralds a change in staff. So I took a job as a writer in residence for a high security male prison, which was not something I'd really
I was going to ask you about.
And that changed my writing. So it made my writing darker, and I suddenly found myself writing a domestic thriller about a young woman lawyer who goes into a prison to handle a killer's appeal. And the story is told from her point of view and a young girl who lives in her block of flats. And I found another agent, and she sold it to Penguin. And that was the beginning of 5 books with Penguin in the last 5 years that have got into the top 10 of the Sunday Times, all of them, which is very exciting.
That's brilliant. So what made you not give up during that period? I mean, you went through a really hard time, marriage breakdown, losing your job. These are things that can quite often rob people of their creativity for quite some time. So.
Yes, I mean, before that, my novels had been turned down. So I'd had 12 novels that had been turned down before that. And as I said, I sort of liken it to getting pregnant, that, you try to get pregnant, you find that you're not, and you think, can I go through this again? And then you have to, because your body makes you want to. And with me, when I was trying to get published, I got that, crashing disappointment every time it got turned down. And then another idea would come into my head, and I would just simply have to write it. And I think that's what happens when you are a writer. You just have to carry on, but your sense of worth can suffer hugely. So, yes, one of the biggest things for me when I first got published was I had got published, and that was wonderful. But I still go through agonies every time a book is published about, is it going to be right? Is it going to do okay? So.
It's very true for all authors. The second you send that manuscript off, you're so nervous. It's very difficult. Very difficult. So just go back to the high security prison. How did you find that? And was that a very difficult job to do?
Well, it started when I moved house after my marriage ended, and I had maintenance, but I had to really do something that earned regular money as opposed to freelance work. And again, my confidence had been knocked by my women's magazine column going. So one of my new neighbours said, you must look at such and such a paper at the creative arts column. And I did. And that very first week, it was almost like fate, was this advert. And I wanted, writer in residence. And I thought, well, I don't want to go to prison. And this particular prison was very near the house that we all used to live in, our family house. And I applied thinking I ought to do this, and thinking, well, I won't get it, so that's all right. And I got it, and I was totally terrified. But my mother, who died quite young in her 50s, always used to say, invention is the mother of necessity, or was it the other way around? I can never remember. But anyway, necessity is the mother of invention. And I thought, I'm going to do this. And I found if I didn't know what people had done, it was fine. And we talked about books, and people, the men, I called them my students, didn't have to come to my workshops as they had to attend education. I was a voluntary thing. They had to get permission from their wings. It was a democratically run prison, and they would come on because they were genuinely interested in words. So on the whole, it was fine. I was rather horrified when I first started to discover I wasn't going to have an officer there. I was totally unsupervised unless I invited people in. So when I had a speaker in, like Colin Dexter, who I knew very well, he kindly came to give a talk. Then there were officers, but otherwise I was very much on my own with people who'd committed the worst crimes you can imagine, and probably on most occasions, with one or two exceptions, I was very well treated. And so my brief was to help them write life stories, poetry, novels, short stories, and the thinking behind it was, as we know, writing is very cathartic. It helps us address our past. And some people, when they commit terrible crimes, can't address it. And that is an important stage if they're going to be better people when they're released. It also increases their self-confidence. And I did, again, go through a crisis of confidence, thinking, why would one want to help someone increase their confidence if they've done these terrible things? But actually, it is, again, part of being a better person. And I joked that I said yes to 2 men in 1 month, because after 2 years, the governor asked if I'd stay for a third year, because I was doing 2 days a week. And a family friend asked if I'd marry him. And I said yes to both. And then my new husband and I moved a long way away from the prison, and I would commute back every week with a prison officer who lived near us in our new house. And he had a prison van, so I'd commute in his prison van. I was terribly worried my new neighbours might see him.
So what did the neighbours say? Yeah.
Exeter Thursday station. Yeah. But as I said, it did change me in many ways that I wasn't aware of at the time. My romance got darker, and then a very good friend of mine said to me, Jane, you should write crime. And I said, no, I don't know anything about policemen knocking on doors. And she said, but you work in a prison. And I thought, well, what I'm really interested in is relationships in prison, relationships between people in prison and the outside. And now all my books have that in them.
That's really interesting. So let's talk about I Made a Mistake. Where did that idea come from? Was it directly from that time?
Well, no, actually. I mean, as I said, all my books have this prison element. I don't think I can ever really escape it. But what happened was, I was in Spain about 2 years ago, and I opened my car door, and I did look, but something came shooting along. I just closed it in time, and it was one of those where it could have been a really nasty accident for both the person on the bike and for me, and it made me have one of these sliding door plot ideas. You know, what if a woman came to after a coma and discovered that actually she'd been having an affair, and then the other sliding door bit was, what if she'd woken up and realized she almost had an affair and hadn't? You know, what would happen to both sliding door bits? And I ran it past my editor, and she said, well, you know, I really like that, but I'm not sure if the sliding door bit would work. But what she said, what she was interested in was a woman who'd had an affair, because we're always hearing about men having affairs. But what would make a woman who isn't unhappily married, but not brilliantly happily married with 2 teenagers, what would make her risk everything for an affair? And actually, we're great suckers for our first loves, aren't we? We're always thinking of first loves. So I gave.
I can remember that far back, actually.
But I also am very interested in the 60s and the 70s. You know, I was born in the mid 50s, and we lived with my grandmother, and she was a very chic, unusual, widowed young granny, and there were atmospheres in our house. She was my mother's mother-in-law. Life wasn't easy. My father would mutter darkly about 2 women in the kitchen. And I like to write a story from 2 points of view. And my second point of view was going to be a court scene, because there are court scenes throughout. You know that somebody's up to something, but you don't know what. And actually, Betty, my mother-in-law, got bigger and bigger. And I wrote to my editor, and she was sending an email to me at the same time. It was really weird. And we both said, Betty's got to be the second person. So Betty's story goes back to her first love in the 1960s and getting married. Well, in fact, before that. she was born in the late 40s, but it goes through her first marriage in the 60s and how different things were. I mean, I've got goosebumps just talking about it, because, you know, that time was something I remember really clearly, but the morals and our attitudes towards marriage and love have changed so much since then. So the alternate chapters are Betty's talking about life from the 1960s. And that seems to be something that's mentioned in all the reviews, actually.
I found the Betty character fantastic. I really liked her. And what I wondered was, because you're a grandmother yourself now, did you find yourself drawing on your experiences as a grandmother, as well as looking back at your experiences as a child within that relationship?
I did. I don't think anything prepares you until you're a grandmother for that intense primal love that you see when you need that little scrap of a little thing. It's just, it hurts. It's like a punch in the gut. And in fact, I write a weekly column for my weekly magazine, a digital column called Diary of a Modern Gran. And I bring in all the funny things that happen, because there are funny things. And when you're looking after them for 22 hours a week, you know, things happen that you hope don't happen, like dropping them and, oh my goodness me, some really scary things. And that intense love. So yes, that did all come in.
Yeah, no, I loved your portrayal of teenagers, and actually there was one point I just burst out laughing because it was just my kids, because I've got two girls and there's two girls in the book. So I mean, talk about your children as teenagers. How did you get on with them?
I adore my children. I feel so lucky, and they're all writers actually, and they're all very creative. I mean, my daughter's a teacher, but she still writes, and my boys write. But I have to say that when I was thinking of Betty and her teenagers, I was thinking more of me living with my grandmother until we were 12, till I was 12. And then we moved around the corner from her because my mother felt she needed her in space. But my grandmother was the one I would go to. If I had a disagreement with my parents, I would go straight to my grandmother, who was called Doris. We weren't allowed to call her Granny because it made her feel old. And I remember distinctly going to our first disco with my friends, and not liking it, and going to the security of my grandmother's for the evening instead. So I think I drew more on Doris, to be honest. Yeah, although she did not have a life, she didn't have a love life like Betty's, but it was more her rather eccentric character.
We also write about abusive relationships. What did you draw on to write those? Because they're very well done within the books. So
I imagined it, but you know, as a journalist, you come across people's stories over the years. So Jock is an amalgamation of people. He's no particular person. He's an amalgamation, but he's also a product of his time. And again, I wanted to get across the fact that husbands had very different attitudes in the 60s and the 70s. And I distinctly remember hearing about men who didn't want their wives to work because it made them feel as though they couldn't provide themselves. And that's why Jock won't let Betty work. So, yes.
And then you've also got the modern marriage in the book as well, with the pressures of work and trying to look after children, and Betty helps them out. It was that ideas from your own life, or watching your children try to cope with their children?
Well, I turned freelance, I said, when my eldest was born, and he's now 36. And I think it's very hard when two of you are working, and it's fascinating for me to observe what people are saying now during, I can't help call it the corny virus. It's fascinating for me to watch home workers, because I've been doing this since I was 27, and the pressures are huge, and people don't always take you seriously. You know, they wouldn't. You know, they'd turn up and thinking that you kind of play at work. I had some hysterical moments with my children. When I would sometimes take them with me to interview quite famous people if I was stuck. And Pam Ayres, for example, was just wonderful when I asked her if I could bring my eldest with me, and her nanny looked after him while we did the interview. I mean,
leave him there for the day.
The very worst thing that happened to me, oh dear, was, I'm not even sure I should admit this because it's going to be recorded, but I will anyway. For 2 years I had some help, which was a complete disaster. We had an au pair, and I don't think we're very good at living with strangers. And anyway, I took her with me up to the BBC where I was being interviewed, and my children were then something like 3 and 5 and 8. And no, older than that, 3, and then whatever the difference, a bit older. And I left them with her on this sofa while I went to do this interview, and came back, and they'd been colouring. I'd given them crayons and pencils, and they'd coloured on this sofa, and I had to go tell the receptionist. I felt really awful about it, but yeah. So I've got lots of funny stories about homeworking. Yes, so. So that was the other thing. So I made Poppy run an extra agency, because I've always been interested in what it would be like to be an extra. And in fact, one of my children did it for a bit, and he had some, fantastic stories. I didn't use his stories, but I interviewed lots and lots of agencies. And because I thought that would give Poppy a wide cast of characters to get involved with. Yeah,
she does. They're good. Yeah. So in terms of, because you're working at home writing the novel, how do you structure your day, and how do you go about it? Are you a sit down and write, or do you plan to infinity and then write? How do you go about?
I get an idea which normally flashes into my mind about halfway through the novel I'm writing. And I will try to tell it to go away because I'm busy writing this one, and it won't go away. So then I write down notes, and I kind of let it sit in my head. I have an Aga. I cook on, I've always cooked for years. I cooked an Aga. So I describe it like putting it in the slow oven, and I let it cook there. And then I will think of the characters that will people that novel, and I use the word people as a verb because I like to write from the point of view of 2 people. I need to make those 2 people very different. So I think about what would make them different. I think about how they would work in the plot, and quite often in my books you don't know how the 2 are connected. You do, and I made a mistake. You know immediately that Poppy and Betty are daughter and mother-in-law. But with my other books, you don't know how the 2 connect till you get to the middle, because I love twists. I'm one of those really irritating people that will say at the beginning, I think something happened. So my second husband is very used to that now, but I love twists. And then I will write quite a long synopsis, and I plot much more than I used to, and that's partly because I've been encouraged to do that by my wonderful editor at Penguin. And then we will brainstorm it, and then I will write a first version, and then quite often I will change that afterwards. So it's a long process, and I have to write in the mornings. Mornings are my writing time. When I was working at the prison, I was also I was also tutoring in creative writing at Oxford University, and another project. I was working my socks off, and I couldn't write during the day, and I had my youngest to bring up, who was then at the time 13, and so the others were at university, and I had to write in the evening. And I always used to think, I can't do this, but actually because I needed to write, mentally needed to write apart from anything else, I taught myself to write in the evening, but my best time is the morning. So now I'm very lucky. My husband's retired. I get up early. I'm very much an early person. I get up, I walk the dog along our beach, and I swim about 7 months of the year in a wetsuit with a friend for safety, and then I come back.
That's too brave for me.
Well, I never thought I was going to be that kind of. It's amazing, and my friends and family know that they shouldn't interrupt me unless it's an emergency, because I get very twitchy if I'm interrupted, I'm afraid. and my dog sits behind me on the sofa, and then I have lunch, and then I will do other things in the afternoon, or I will do admin. I mean, there's always admin. And when I have a granny day, I can't write, so then I do write in the evenings instead. When the little one had his nap, I would write while he had his nap. So life has to be flexible, doesn't it? And yes. I think what we're going through has really shown us that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, quite a few of the people listening are also writers. What would be your top tips for them?
Well, there are lots of top tips, but I mean, I can say the old thing about don't give up, but I will also say, if you are being rejected again and again, try and get some feedback. Now that might not do, but some agents will say, well, actually, I don't think that character was deep enough, or what. If they say it doesn't fit the list, that basically means it's can be a polite way of saying it's not for them. It might just be it's not the kind of book they handle. If they say it's too similar to something else they've taken on, then that's a good sign. So try and get some feedback. if you're looking for an agent nowadays, the big thing seems to be to follow them on Twitter and build up a relationship and go to literary festivals. I helped to found the Sidmouth Literary Festival in Devon, and we usually have a big day called How to Get Published, where my Penguin editor comes down, and we have other editors, we have other experts. So we couldn't run it this year, but hopefully we will next year. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me about that, if they contact you and you pass it on, I'm really happy to help.
Absolutely will do.
But from a structural point of view, I think the thing is to find that idea which makes you burn inside, and where you feel that perhaps other people might be interested. Now, how are you going to know that? Sometimes it helps to write a first line, any first line, for shock effect. So to write a first line that, whereas if you were in a bookshop and you were browsing through, which we probably won't be able to do anymore, touching, but anyway, if you read that first line and you have to read on, then that could be your beginning. That could actually be your incentive. You might not know what the plot is about, but if you come up with a cracking good line, that could really inspire you. And the same goes for a title. Just if you can imagine a title which has to make somebody read on, that might give you the clue for your book. The other thing is pace. I mean, pace is so important. If you let it drag in the first chapter, even if something big happens in the third chapter, you will have lost that agent by then, because an agent can only look through a certain number of submissions, and you've got to catch that agent really fast on that, in that first paragraph. And so to keep the pace going, but character more. My strength as a journalist, plot was always hugely important to me, and it's taken me some years to work on character. And characters have got to be deep. You've got to think about why they would do something. What is it in their background that makes them work in a certain way? What are they scared of? What do they wish they had done? What personal possession do they have that they would not go out without? What do they really want? Who do they love? What did they wish they had done? What do they want to do? So really, really spend some time thinking about the characters. And I don't necessarily mean sitting at the desk thinking about it. Most of my ideas happen when I'm doing something completely different. So
mine do too. I understand. So you're going to read a passage from the book to us now, but what I wanted to say before we start is if people have got a question they want to ask, please use the Q&A box at the bottom right hand side of your screen, so you can be asking questions while Jane's reading to us.
And am I allowed to say that here we are, put the cover up, I made a mistake. I made a mistake is available in supermarkets and bookshops and online, and in fact at the moment it's on special offer for just 99p with Kindle, which is pretty
it's a bargain.
And I've really discovered Kindle during coronavirus when the bookshops were closed, and it is amazing what you can get. As I said, the printed book is really important as well, but I just thought I'd mention that it is only 99p at the moment for a limited time. So I'm going to start off with the prologue. I do rather like prologues. Just going to have a slurp of my hot water and lemon. Waterloo Underground Station, Platform 3, January, early evening. Mind the gap, scream the yellow capital letters on the edge of the platform. But not everyone can see the writing on the danger zone. Only the passengers at the very front, who are being pushed by those at the back, centimetre by centimetre, further and further towards the empty track. It's a bit like one of those coin machines in an amusement arcade, where you just need to shove a few more pennies in to send the whole lot tumbling. At least there's a help button on the wall. But how fast can you get to it in an emergency surrounded by a crowd like this? Maybe not fast enough. It is 6:30 p.m, rush hour. Platform 3 for the Bakerloo line from Waterloo to Queen's Park is teeming. Commuters, taut and grey after a day in the office, gaze yearningly at the white sand poster for Mauritius on the other side of the line. Go on, take a spring break. A woman with flamingo pink acrylic nails opens her briefcase as if to check something and then snaps it shut. A man whips off his yellow tie before stuffing it in the right-hand pocket of his jacket. A couple in black are in fervent discussion about the deceased and the court cases. Lawyers or funeral mourners? Tricky to tell. Either way, neither will forget this day. A musician with a cello is humming quietly. She does not know it, but a piece of chewing gum has stuck to her shoe. Only when she returns home that night, shocked and barely able to speak, will she find it. By then, it will seem irrelevant compared with the tragedy she will have witnessed. A middle-aged Japanese couple, almost dwarfed by their giant silver metallic suitcases, observe their surroundings with confusion. The man is rifling through his shoulder bag as if looking for something. If only they had been somewhere else, there might have been a very different ending to their holiday. A bleary-eyed student nurses a Starbucks cup, and amidst them all, a young woman is holding up a plastic-wrapped cream wedding dress, as if to keep it creaseless from the mob around her. The stale air tastes of booze, frustration, routine, and expectation. A message flashes up on the board. Train approaching. Where will the doors open? Here, there are no sliding glass panels for safety as on the Jubilee line. The favoured few who had found respite on the metallic rows of seats lining the walls leap up, upset to find themselves trapped at the back of the throng. Later, they will count their blessings. Mind the gap, please, exhorts a pre-recorded announcement. The male voice, with its emphasis on the last word, carries just the right balance of courtesy and warning. No excuse now. There is a rush of air as the train nears the station. More last-minute arrivals from the back surge forward, hoping to grab a spot, even though they should, by rights, wait for the next. Greed can kill. They will learn that soon enough. The train is in sight now, speeding closer. Minds are set on the preparation to pounce, jostle shoulders, squeeze through somehow. How on earth will the Japanese couple manage with those enormous cases? Apprehension is tight, knuckles clench. Everyone is determined to board, whatever it takes. There are children to meet, partners, cats, lovers, first dates, work shifts, flights that can't be missed. Brace for the race. Then it happens. Did the victim cry out? Hard to know with the thunder of the train and the screech of its brakes as it tries to stop in time. Mind the gap, please, repeats the disembodied announcement in oblivious irony. There's a split second of horrified silence. Then a woman screams. And I just want to read, just to show the difference, how, and this was intentional, the difference in style, just a tiny bit from chapter 1, 6 weeks earlier. Poppy, how are you? My heart fills with love and pride as an enormous orange and black striped tiger bounds up and flings her arms around me. Jennifer, I say, hugging her back. I know that as an agent, I shouldn't have favourite clients, but there's something so warm and endearing about this one that I simply can't help it. Isn't this party amazing, she says, finally letting me go from her tigger hug and wiping the trickle of sweat running down her face, the only part of her that isn't camouflaged by costume. Everyone else is in evening dress, but Jennifer is a one-off. And then that's the party, and then right at the end, the party, Poppy almost didn't get to the party, she had to look after, make sure her teenage children had their homework and everything sorted. If it wasn't for Betty, she couldn't have got there. But then right at the end of this party, at the end of chapter 1, I cannot breathe. Pops, he says, now standing so close that I can smell his minty breath. No one has called me that for years. I am aware of several jaws dropping around me and the unspoken, please introduce me expressions. This is a man whose name would mean nothing to my children. It might not mean much to my generation either, unless they have encyclopedic memories like Jennifer. But it doesn't really matter. People would be staring anyway. This man is objectively drop-dead handsome in a 50-plus way, and he has presence in spades. Matthew puts out his hand to shake mine. His skin feels warm, just as it had 23 years and 3 months ago, when it at last pressed against mine in my little Kilburn bedsit with its 1-bar electric fire. Pops, what a lovely surprise. So
that's great.
I just wanted to show with those readings how I really purposely tried to get a different tone in each one. So I had the omniscient narrator with the prologue, which is the only time the omniscient narrator comes on is with that and the court scenes. And then I start with a very light note in this woman being hugged by a tiger. You think, what's going on here? And then the party progresses until this man comes in whom Poppy hasn't seen for 23 years. So different, as I said, different paces, different tones.
Yes, they're very clear, the different voices through the book. You really hear them. Right, we've got some questions for you. You ready? So we've got one from Andrew Snowden, and he says, should a person not from a journalistic background always do a course in creative writing before undertaking a novel?
I don't think it's necessary. I think there are some great courses around, really good ones. And I think they can be incredibly helpful in showing you how to show and not tell, and helping you dig into characters. I don't think they're totally necessary. I think reading is important, reading and understanding and dissecting how other authors build up character and plot, just as part of your learning, just like when you're learning to drive, if you observe other drivers, good drivers, that's helpful. Did I do courses? Yes, I did do a course, actually. I did, going back years and years, I actually went to a course I lived near Oxford at the time, and I went to the course and I eventually ended up by teaching. And that did help me with characters. And there are some great ones around. Curtis Brown and Faber, I've heard some very good reports of. And there's some, yes, and some good MBAs, but not totally essential. But worth bearing in mind.
That's great. Right, Laura Birkin, she says, hi Jane, interesting talk. Thank you. Has anything in the current lockdown and crisis we've been living in prompted you to look at areas you might not have followed up before?
Yes, timescales. So my next year's book was going to be set in 2020, but then that caused all kinds of problems to do with relationships and cuddles and kisses. So I had to completely redo the timescale and set it in 2019. So that's the first thing. And I have to tell you that maths is not my best subject. In fact, I'm renowned for being hopeless at it. So that was quite complicated. What else has it made me look at? It's made me look at families, actually, because families, for me, have taken on an even bigger importance, and not necessarily my nearest and dearest, always hugely important, but other people, and like many, I've reconnected with people I was at school with, and Zoom talks, and rediscovered old friends. So yes, it's made me look at friendship and family and impermanence, the lack of permanence in things, and the desire the need to embrace the fact that things don't change. And I think that is definitely going to come through. Can I just also pick up on something that I meant to say with the previous caller, and that is that being a journalist is not actually, I don't think, an advantage in being a novelist, because you write in a different way. So
it's completely different style. Yes.
I had to relearn my style. So please don't think you need to be a journalist first. Yes.
No,
so
that's great. Sorry, were you going to say something else?
Well, no, I was just trying to think. It's a really interesting question, that last one about making me rethink. So as I said, I think family and characters were always important in my novels as well as real life, but they're going to be more important in both.
That's great. So just looking down the questions here, I should have got my reading glass. Right, so Pam Pacey says, your titles and straplines are what make me buy your books. They are as exciting as a strong first line. When and how do you come up with them?
Oh, well, it depends which book we're talking about. It's a great question. So I made a mistake. It was actually my editor's idea, because we wanted to get across this feeling of Poppy knows she's made a mistake, and she holds her hands up. So each book is different, and sometimes the title just pops into your head and you're very grateful for that. Sometimes you work on it, you get the beginnings of it, and you work away at it. When I wrote Blood Sisters, which is about two sisters and a best friend, and you don't know which is which. When I thought I'm going to tell my sister about this one, and I said, it's called Blood Sisters, and she immediately said, well, I hope it's not about me. And I said, no, of course it's not, But you can't write a book about sisters. Well, I couldn't write a book about sisters without knowing what it's like to be a sister, and I'm so glad I have a sister. I love her dearly, but it was quite funny, her reaction. So you do worry a little bit about reactions, actually. Yeah.
That's great. So Daniela Norris, she's asked, I've changed my writing style and topics dramatically, from political to inspirational following a trauma. How does one reinvent themselves as a writer? I had an agent and publisher for my political writing, but starting afresh now. Sounds like you've had an experience of changing writing style too.
Yeah. Okay. So after that 12, actually, was it 12? I kind of lose count, and it might even been 13 books that weren't published. After that last one, I didn't have an agent by then, and somebody put me in touch with an agent who said to me, had I considered changing my name? And I did. And I think there are pros and cons about this. It can be a fresh start. So it can be a fresh start for you mentally, because you're kind of writing as another person. It can be a fresh start for agents to whom you've submitted novels before. I personally think that if you were called Tom Taylor, if you called yourself TJ Taylor, that actually is quite a good idea to use initials, because then someone doesn't know if you're a man or a woman. It perhaps might be more open to it. So I would, if I were you, think about that. It's not always the greatest of ideas. You sometimes feel when you are published under another name that it's not you, but it can lead to a new lease of life in your mind and in other people's. I would also try very hard to find an agent in a different kind of way. So I mentioned Twitter, and I do think that is a great inroad. And I would read magazines, writing magazines, because they're very good at letting you know what agencies have been set up. I would see who is represented by who and approach them. And you're not alone. There are a lot of people who reinvent themselves, and they do very well. And I think it's a great thing to celebrate. And I would think about changing your name to begin with.
That's great. That's really helpful. So what's your view, one of the other questions, but it's anonymous, is what's your view on self-publishing versus publishing, like traditional publishing, going through the agent route?
Okay, so I did actually once self-publish. It was a non-fiction book that I got the rights back to, and I found it incredibly difficult, the laying out and trying to publicize it. I think that if you're going to do it well, you need a team behind you. I went to a talk by the wonderful L.J. Ross some years ago, and she does it very professionally, and talked at the time. I don't know if she still does it, but she had an editor, and she has somebody who does marketing, somebody who does everything else, and she writes it, obviously, and she has the time to concentrate on the writing. At least she did when I was listening to the talk. So I think that's a very good way of doing it. If you try to promote it yourself, you're going to lose your own writing time. If you're going to market it yourself, if you're going to edit yourself, you're not doing it with an independent eye. So I would suggest getting a very good editor to look at it, and having a team to help you. And I think nowadays, I think people are interested in the book and will take it on that as face value. I mean, I feel incredibly lucky to be published by Penguin. To me, it's the Harrods of publishing. I feel so very lucky. And I would just, I wouldn't say one was, I can't say one is better than the other, because it depends on each situation. But I would say if you're going to self-publish, to do it as professionally as possible.
Oh, that's great, Jane. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been brilliant to see you, and I'm sure everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. So the interview will be, it's great. Yeah. So the interview will be available on our Facebook page later, so you can have a look at that and forward it on if you want to. And if you have enjoyed today, then you may be interested in some of the other online events that we have coming up, including an interview with Ken Follett on the 30th of June. and with Prince William and Prince Harry's uncle Earl Spencer in September. So keep a lookout for our events list on our website and on our Facebook page. And if you join the Society as a friend for £25, if you're not a writer, then you'll be able to find out about all these events firsthand from our newsletters. So thank you very much for joining us today, and don't forget to go and get your copy of Jane's book for the weekend. So goodbye everyone, and thanks ever so much, Jane. I'll see you soon.
Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.